Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, Tigrayan rebels start handing over their heavy weapons. It's a key condition of a deal signed in November to end a deadly conflict that's ravaged Ethiopia for 2 years. Also, Rwanda says it does not have any intention of banning Congolese refugees, accusing the media of misrepresenting President Paul Kagame's words when he said that it was not his country's problem. And the Church of England says it will spend around €105 million in communities affected by historic slavery in an attempt to reconcile for its sins as an early investor in the transatlantic slave trade. But first, in a crucial step that reinforces a peace deal aimed at ending a 2-year conflict in Ethiopia, Tigrayan fighters have said that they began handing over their heavy weaponry on Wednesday. The disarmament of rebel forces is a key term of an agreement signed between fighters from the northern region of Tigray and the federal government back in November. Fighting has largely stopped since then, allowing the ramping up of desperately needed humanitarian operations in Tigray. Laurent Berstecker has more.
Rows of tanks and heavy artillery now in the hands of Ethiopian forces. The TPLF began handing over its weapons on Wednesday and expressed hope the federal government would also abide by the terms of the peace agreement.
Tigray has handed over its heavy weapons as part of its commitment to implementing the Pretoria Agreement. We hope and expect this will go a long way in expediting the full implementation of the agreement.
The November 2nd peace deal marked the end of a bloody 2-year civil war in Ethiopia. It saw TPLF leaders commit to a full disarmament of their forces and to restoring federal authority in Tigray, while the government pledged to reopen access to a region that had been cut off from the outside world for over a year. The African Union, which was supervising the disarmament process, said both sides were so far abiding by the deal and hailed its own role in mediating the peace process.
It's a step in the right direction in achieving the African Union aim of silencing the guns by the year 2030, which translates to solving African problems by Africans.
Over the past 2 months, there have been encouraging signs of normalizing relations between the warring parties. In December, commercial flights resumed between Addis Ababa and Mekele, a few days after a government delegation visited Tigray's regional capital for the first time in 2 years.
Look now to news in brief. China's new foreign minister opened the African Union's new headquarters in Addis Ababa on Wednesday as he started a 5-country African tour. China, Africa's largest trading partner for over a decade, financed construction of the building. Minister Qin Yang took office in December, and his visit is the 33rd consecutive year that China's foreign minister has made Africa the first overseas tour of the calendar year. Qin will also visit Gabon, Angola, Benin, and Egypt. Uganda and the World Health Organization say that the country's latest Ebola outbreak is over. No new cases have been registered for 42 days. 142 cases were recorded and at least 56 people died during the latest crisis caused by the Sudan strain of the virus. A pathologist has said that an LGBT campaigner whose body was dumped in a box by the side of the road was smothered to death. Edwin Chiloba died from asphyxiation after socks were stuffed into his mouth and a piece of denim tied around his face. The death of the model and fashion designer has sparked outrage. 5 people have been arrested in connection to his murder, including his roommate, who's the main suspect of the killing. Charges have yet to be brought. Now, Rwanda's backtracked on President Paul Kagame's speech to Parliament on Monday, in which he said that his country could not continue to welcome Congolese refugees. The government spokesperson since accused the media of misrepresenting Kagame's words and said that refugees would not be banned from entering Rwanda. This update from Clément Di Roma.
According to the government spokesperson bringing clarifications to Kagame's speech, the country has no intention to expel refugees and welcomes them, saying that the president was only addressing the hypocrisy in criticizing Rwanda. These statements came at a time when the Rwandan affairs regarding refugees are under heavy scrutiny from international media, especially since the country's deal with the UK to take in asylum seekers was ruled legal by the British High Court, pending an appeal. The rising tensions with DR Congo are also a sensitive regional topic. Kigali is regularly accused of supporting the M23 rebel group by its neighbor, but also by the UN and Western countries, but denies it. In this context, the Rwandan government spokesperson said on Wednesday that international media outlets chose to misrepresent Kagame's call for leadership and accountability as a threat to expel or ban refugees, after his remarks before the Senate last Monday. The president said, I quote, that Rwanda cannot keep being host to refugees for which we are later on held accountable in some way or even abused about. However, he did not announce specific measures to stop Congolese fleeing violence in North Kivu from entering the country.
Now, after a 4-year absence, Benin's main opposition Democrat Party has returned to parliament with a 28-seat win in the weekend's election. Sunday's exercise went without a hitch, which was a huge relief for those who remember the violence that broke out in 2019 when opposition parties weren't allowed to take part. This year, 3 out of the 7 parties in the running were in opposition, so Sophie Lamotte has more.
After being excluded from political life for the last 4 years, opposition parties were back on the ballot this Sunday, and they garnered significant support. The Benins parliament will continue to be dominated by the 2 main presidential parties who maintain a firm majority, but they will now have to share power with a force from the opposition, the Democrats. They now occupy a quarter of the seats in parliament. For this analyst, this puts Benin back on the map as a beacon of hope for democracy in Africa.
It's a return to normality for Benin, as opposed to what we've seen in 2019, which resulted in a lack of interest among Beninese in parliamentary activity and political life. It explains the low turnout that we experienced on Sunday.
A low voter turnout, roughly 38% for these elections, that could have great implications for the upcoming presidential elections of 2026. Any party that wants to run for the presidential elections needs at least 10% of support in these legislative elections.
The true winners were the Democrats, simply because the first challenge for this party was to get 10% of the votes. And they did much more than that. They actually challenged one of the main presidential parties, the Republican bloc, in terms of support.
These elections have also been celebrated as a step forward for gender equality, with women now occupying over 20% of seats in parliament, as opposed to roughly 5% before.
Sophie Lamotte there for us. Meanwhile, DR Congo's preparations for elections due at the end of the year are underway. The country is about halfway through a crucial voter registration drive that kicked off on Christmas Eve. Voters are being ID'd and registered in the country's western provinces. If all goes well there, the exercise moves on to eastern provinces in February. However, some Congolese observers are already worried about some hiccups that they've spotted. Our correspondent talks us through.
In this Kinshasa neighborhood, registering for elections requires patience. The nationwide process started in late December 23 in DRC's western provinces. This National Independent Electoral Commission office has been busy ever since. The waiting is long here. There are only 2 machines to register future voters: identity identification form, fingerprinting, pictures. This student has waited 4 hours to get his card.
It requires patience. There are a lot of people, but it's important.
This card grants him the right to vote during the presidential, legislative, and provincial elections, all scheduled for late 2023 by the National Independent Electoral Commission. But Esther is not even sure she is going to vote. The solicitor says her voting documents will still come in handy day to day.
Here in DRC, we don't have identity cards, so this voter card will come in handy for financial transactions, to access some offices and buildings.
The National Independent Electoral Commission has to register over 20 million Congolese by the end of January. Some believe the goals overly ambitious.
In certain provinces, the Electoral Commission hasn't been able to send material due to lack of transportation means, shoddy roads, and no vehicles available. We seriously doubt that this 30-day time frame set by the Commission to cover the first operational area will ever be respected.
The National Electoral Commission admits that the exercises had a rough start. It also says that its agents are quickly getting used to the registration technology and will keep on picking up pace as they race to get the IDs to voters.
Now, more than 15 million men, women and children were victims of one of the darkest chapters of human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Last year, the Church of England apologised for its role as an early investor in the unethical business. This week, it's announced that it will spend around €105 million in communities affected by historical slavery in an attempt to reconcile for the harm done. Sam Bradpeace brings us more from Dakar.
In the 18th century, the Church of England invested well over £443 million in the South Sea Company. This was a company given a monopoly by the British state to take slaves from the west coast of Africa to the Spanish Americas. It conducted at least 96 transatlantic voyages from 1714 to 1739, transporting at least 34,000 enslaved people in appalling conditions. During this time, the Church of England also received large donations from wealthy benefactors with close ties to the transatlantic slave trade. In a bid to make up for this, it has announced the creation of a new £100 million investment fund aimed at improving the lives of people from communities historically affected by the transatlantic slave trade, although the Church stopped short of naming these communities or giving specific examples. It said that it hoped the fund would grow over time so that reinvestments could be made and impact maximised.
Sam Bradpeace there for us. That is, though, all we have time for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Welcome to Iceland, a country where equality is no empty word.
I would love to be a stay-at-home dad. The baby gets like 1 year that it can spend with its parents, and it's divided into 6 months for dad, 6 months for mom.
Here, little girls are taught not to be afraid. And even if all is not perfect,
sometimes I am asked, how can you explain that in this equality paradise that Iceland is, that gender-based violence still exists?
Icelanders are determined to serve as role models to the world.
We still have a way to go, but we are on the path, I think, to the future of possibly gender equality.
Iceland, a gender equality paradise, in Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.